And this evening we have DCRT's Natural Flood Management Officer, Debbie Coldwell, talking about how we can use nature-based solutions to help reduce the likelihood of flooding. So I'll pass on to Debbie now.
Thank you. So yeah, hopefully everybody can hear me okay. I do sometimes have slightly dodgy internet, so Sally is going to shout if you're struggling to hear me, in which case I'll maybe have to turn my video off, but hopefully you can hear me okay, and yeah, we'll get through without too many connection issues. So yeah, thank you everybody for joining this evening. As Sally said, I'm Debbie Coldwell. I'm the Natural Flood Management Officer for the Don Catchment Rivers Trust, and I'm going to be talking to you about flooding and how we can help reduce flood risk by working with nature. So before we get started, just to let you know, we are recording the talk this evening so that any people that can join us tonight can catch it at a later date. So yeah, as Sally said, we've kind of turned all the microphones off, and I don't think you'll be recorded if your video's on, but if you don't want to be in the recording, to be extra sure, turn your videos off, and that might help as well actually with my internet potentially. So if you do want to turn videos off now, that would potentially be a help, and then we can always turn them back on again when we're doing questions at the end so that we can see your faces. So yeah, if you do have any questions as we go through, just pop them in the chat, and then Sally's going to help pick those out at the end, and I'll try and answer as best as I can then. As this is the 5th in the series of online talks that we've been doing, I'm not going to go into too much detail about who we as Don Catchment Rivers Trust are, as I know some of you have been to all of the talks now, so you'll probably know it better than we do. I will just say that we are a river conservation charity, part of the wider Rivers Trust movement. Currently, we've got 7 members of staff, and our aim is to protect, enhance, restore the rivers of the Don Catchment, and to try and reconnect people back to those rivers and their heritage. So we've got lots of different activities that we deliver to help achieve this, from removing weirs or installing fish passes to allow fish migration in our rivers, through to enhancing river habitats, as we saw in Matt's woody debris talk a couple of weeks ago, as well as running lots of volunteer days, doing different activities under normal circumstances, of course, putting on events and activities for the public and school kids to get them involved with and excited about their local rivers. So just another little reminder, if that's okay, for people to turn microphones and videos off as we get into this now, just so that we don't have too much background noise going on, if that's all right. Thank you. So another aspect that the Trust is now involved with is reducing flood risk, which is the core focus of my role and the talk this evening. I started with the Trust very nearly 2 years ago now. So in the last part of the talk, I'll just tell you a bit about the work that we've been doing to help reduce flood risk. But I wanted to start by giving you some background info on flooding generally, why it's high on the agenda at the moment, how the risk from flooding has been managed in the past, and why there's now a lot of work going into reducing flood risk by working with nature. So why does flooding occur? It's important to remember that flooding is a natural phenomenon. In a healthy natural ecosystem, you'll still get flooding. And this happens after prolonged periods of heavy rainfall, where you have water falling throughout the landscape right from the top of the catchment, where you'll get more and more water accumulating as you go downstream, with increasing amounts of water flowing into streams that come together in rivers and eventually all merge in lowland rivers that fill up and spill out onto the floodplain. That being said, there are a whole host of reasons why flooding is getting worse, both in terms of the amount and the intensity of flood events that we're experiencing, and the damage being caused by these floods, well above and beyond what we would expect from naturally occurring flooding, as we know all too well from this area. So first off, climate change. Climate change is causing both more rainfall and at greater intensities. So we're getting greater quantities of water falling in the first place, and when it is, it's falling harder and faster. So it's much more difficult for water to be slowed and captured in the landscape in these conditions. It will just tend to kind of pool on the surface or rush quickly into drains and rivers, which can be quickly overwhelmed, leading to flooding. Another major issue is land use and management. So where our natural environments and green spaces have been built on and developed, we're replacing woodlands and grasslands, for example, with impermeable surfaces such as concrete and tarmac. So water can no longer drain into soils, but again, it just kind of sits on the top and rushes off instead. And we've lost many of our wetlands now, which are incredibly important in helping to reduce flood risk, as they act like massive sponges, soaking up water during heavy rains and then slowly releasing them again once storms have subsided. Agricultural intensification and practices have also had a big impact on how rainwater travels through the landscape. So for example, we've got lots of heavily compacted soils now that are unable to absorb water, again causing heavy rains to sit on top of fields and rush and cause lots of runoff. So you combine all of these issues with a sewer system that can no longer cope with the amount of runoff and rain draining into it, and the fact that we're building in floodplains and areas prone to flooding, and you're inevitably going to get a lot more flooding and in places where it's going to cause a lot of damage. So some of the ways that we've managed our rivers in the past for various reasons, including to try and help manage flooding, has actually also made things worse. So many of our rivers have been straightened, canalised, culverted and constricted by flood banks and walls. They've been tidied, so removing kind of rougher vegetation around the edges, removing trees and other natural barriers from within the channel, as Matt was talking about in his talk a couple of weeks ago. And by removing the wiggles in our rivers and putting them into these smooth concrete channels with no natural obstacles, it just serves to speed up the water flowing through them, which can cause more risk of flooding downstream. Dredging, of course, is another traditional river management technique that every time we get a flood, people argue that it's because we're not dredging rivers anymore. But actually, the evidence shows this isn't the case. Yes, there are some limited circumstances where dredging can be part of the solution, but often the impact would be limited or even make things worse. What's more is the environmental impacts of dredging can be devastating, and it's completely unsustainable, as dredging changes the river dynamics in such a way that it tends to cause greater buildup of sediment, meaning you have to do it again and again, so it's just not really sustainable. And the way we live now in large, densely populated urban areas, often along riverbanks or within flood zones, means that some of these traditional flood defences are still absolutely vital in protecting people and property from flooding. But these flood defences are very much in need of a helping hand. So with the increasing threat of climate change in particular, we simply can't keep building bigger and bigger walls to keep the water out. We need other sustainable solutions to complement traditional defences if we're going to help reduce the risk of flooding in a future of more people in extreme weather. So this brings us nicely on to natural flood management, also referred to as NFM. I'll probably flip between the two as we go on from here. So in natural healthy ecosystems and catchments, natural features would store and slow the flow of water as it makes its way through the catchment and downstream, reducing the chance of flash floods. And as I've been explaining, we've changed our catchments and our landscapes through development and agriculture so that they're less able to naturally slow down floodwaters. So with natural flood management, what we're essentially doing is working with nature to restore some of these features and functions again, so that water is better captured throughout the catchment when it rains, and to try and mimic natural processes that interrupt flows of water and slows them down. So there are 4 key mechanisms underpinning NFM. These are slowing water, storing water, increasing water infiltration into soils, and intercepting rainfall. I'm just going to look at each of these in a little bit more detail now with some more examples. So slowing water, obviously the faster you have water moving through the landscape, the quicker it all gets to the main river networks, which can become overwhelmed. And the faster the speed of water in those rivers, the greater the risk of damage. So you want to slow water wherever you can by increasing the resistance to its flow. And there's a number of different ways that you can do this. So firstly, for example, by increasing the roughness of the ground. So if you think about having kind of a smooth sloped surface and you poured water on it, it's just going to rush over that really quickly. But if you start to put obstacles in its way, it's going to slow it down. So even just having vegetation on that surface, the water will meet with more resistance trying to travel through it. So we can create things like buffer strips, which are wide strips of vegetation around the edges of fields and along riverbanks. And these are left to grow longer and denser. And so they slow runoff. It's just harder for that water to get through it. And these buffer strips can be, just kind of long grasses or hedgerows, or even woodland strips. So another commonly used NFM technique to slow water is the leaky dam. So if you've been involved with NFM at all, you'll no doubt have come across leaky dams. Here's an example of a couple that we've put in with the help of some brilliant volunteers, some of whom are here this evening. As you can see, these are quite simply just logs that are fixed into position across the stream, and they are positioned above the water in normal conditions, so the stream can flow kind of unimpeded as it would do normally, without causing any issues to fish passage or anything like that. And then when you get heavy rain, the water level starts to rise and it will hit the leaky dam and it starts to back up behind it. So I'm just going to play the video now, and I'm not going to talk while it's playing because in case there's any kind of internet issues. So I'll just play it and let you watch, and then I'll carry on talking. So hopefully that played smoothly and you could see the water just kind of rising and backing up and being kind of temporarily stored behind the dam there. So they're called leaky dams for a reason, and that is because they are leaky. So having those gaps reduces the pressure on the dam so that it won't break. And you can put these dams in a series so that each dam, the water is being slowed down behind it, temporarily stored, and ideally if you've got room and it's safe to do so, you extend the dams out wide enough so that water spills onto the woodland floor, meaning again that the water will then have to kind of travel through rougher ground before finding its way back into the river, just slowing it down all the more. So these dams do occur naturally. You may have seen them yourselves while walking along rivers, where you get a tree or big branches that fall into the river, and then you get kind of a natural build-up of woody debris behind it. And they'll function in a similar way, so just slowing down the water in the channel, particularly as levels start to rise. So what we're doing with these really is just kind of replicating that. And there is, of course, the beaver, also known for being an incredibly good dam builder. It makes its home in the safety of the pools created behind the dams. So beavers were native to England, but they were hunted to extinction about 400 years ago. And there's currently a lot of interest in reintroducing beavers in England, particularly because of this ability to build dams and create wetland habitats with great potential for reducing flood risk downstream. So there are multiple beaver trials now underway to get a better understanding of the impacts they might have, both good and bad, which will inform whether they can be released again in England. But obviously for the moment there's not too many of them around, so we and other NFM projects are mimicking them as best we can with our leaky dams to try and help slow flows. So as well as slowing water, NFM also works by storing water. So by creating areas where water can be temporarily stored, filling up when it rains and then slowly emptying after the worst of the storm has passed. So you can put in things like ponds and scrapes, which are essentially very shallow ponds that kind of fill and empty. And you position these in areas within the catchment where they'll be able to sort of intercept water and temporarily store it. You can also use things like earth bunds, so kind of earth dams in the right areas, again, where they're just going to be in the path of water as it's trying to travel through a catchment, and water can collect behind those dams again where it's safe to do so, and then slowly filter through once the rain stops. Improving soil structure so that it's able to absorb more water and to greater depths also comes under the umbrella of NFM. So where you get these compacted soils, for example, on farmland as a result of heavy livestock traffic or vehicles, it can create an impassable barrier to water just below the surface, as I mentioned before, which is when you see water kind of sat on the top of fields or running off. There's different techniques that can help to break up the soil, again, creating more space for water to soak into it. You can use machinery that does this, for example, or you can plant fields with specific mixtures of plants which include deep-rooted species, which basically can force their roots through that compacted layer of the soil, and again just breaks it up so that the water can get back in there. And finally, intercepting rainfall. So this is where rain is captured on vegetation, particularly on tree leaves, so that it evaporates before it's had the chance to reach the ground. So there's less water to contribute to floods. And it's actually quite a surprising amount of rain that can be intercepted in this way. So up to 45% of rainfall has been recorded to be captured in tree canopies and lost to evaporation. So obviously planting trees can play a really big role in helping to reduce flood risk via a number of mechanisms, this being one of them. So the idea is that you want as many of these different features and processes within a landscape as possible. So your NFM catchment might look a little something like this, with woodlands throughout the catchment, woody debris in the rivers at the top there, storing water behind them and spilling out, storage ponds and scrapes scattered throughout, with farm practices that encourage healthy soils and so on. And what we're aiming for with NFM is to help reduce the maximum height of flood waters and to delay the time it takes for those flood waters to reach populated areas downstream. So it gives people just more time to prepare. And generally, the more of these features and processes you have going on in the landscape, the greater the impact you'll have on downstream flood risk. I'm just going to take a sip of water. So it's important to highlight, though, that NFM is no silver bullet either when it comes to flooding, but it is a really important part of the toolkit needed to reduce the severity of flooding. And it complements other tools, such as those hard engineered defences, so the walls and the flood banks, and measures taken within the home that can help make them more resilient to flooding. So although certain NFM type measures have been around for a long time, it's only really been since the big floods of 2007 and 2015 that NFM as a concept kind of really took off. And more monitoring was put in place to better understand how much of an impact NFM could have on reducing flood risk. So what the evidence has told us so far is that NFM measures can reduce flood risk, particularly in smaller catchments and during smaller flood events that tend to happen more frequently. But there's little evidence yet of how much impact NFM has in larger catchments or during kind of the more extreme flood events. And that's not to say that NFM doesn't have an impact in these larger catchments or more extreme events, but that we don't actually have enough evidence yet to know. And that's because it's much harder to get the evidence during these bigger storm events. You know, it's just logistically more difficult because, you know, they're bigger storms, they don't happen that often, and kind of capturing the impacts of NFM at those larger scales is just more difficult. So there's currently quite a lot of research going into trying to understand NFM at these larger scales and more extreme events, and there's quite a lot of money being put into this now with several large-scale projects underway, and so we'll obviously be keeping an eye out for the results of those. But this being said, the evidence suggests that NFM does reduce the maximum height of flood peaks, can do up to sort of 10%, which 10% may not seem like a huge amount, but 10% can be the difference between homes being inundated with water or not. So, you know, it can really have a big impact. And even if it did turn out that NFM is only really effective at the smaller scales or the lower intensity floods, there's a whole suite of other reasons why investing in NFM makes sense. So NFM measures can deliver a wide range of other environmental benefits, including biodiversity benefits. So a lot of NFM work, if done well, can create and enhance wildlife habitat. Obviously think about your tree planting, your hedgerows, your floodplain meadows, all really important wildlife habitat, all those wetlands that you end up creating through NFM. The picture here is an example, so it's a little bit hard to make out, but it's from a scrape that we put in on some farmland, so those shallow pools that I was mentioning earlier. And the photo shows the sort of muddy margins of one of the scrapes. And hopefully you can just about make out that it's absolutely covered in bird footprints. And that's because these scrapes can provide really important feeding areas for birds. And there's lots of invertebrates in there, as well as helping to slow flows. NFM measures can also help improve water quality by trapping and filtering pollutants before they get into rivers. So again, if you think of those buffer strips I was talking about, and vegetation along the banks of rivers, those can intercept fertilizers, pesticide residues, and sediments being washed off of farm fields, for example, as it traps them in the vegetation before it actually gets into the water. Lots of NFM features are also really important for capturing carbon. And obviously NFM can help with climate change adaptation by creating more landscapes that can better cope with extremes. So not only helping with floods, but also droughts, as a lot of these features help retain water in the landscape for longer, which helps recharge aquifers and just providing kind of refuges for things that need sort of cooler, wetter environments. NFM is also cheap when compared to hard engineered solutions, so small communities that might not qualify for traditional flood defences can still be protected through NFM. And finally, NFM reduces pressure on hard engineered defences, so those flood banks and walls and so on, which means that they'll last longer, reducing the maintenance costs of them, so there's a cost saving there as well. So hopefully I've made the case as to why NFM is a really important thing to be doing. And this final section of the talk will just briefly look at what we've been up to in the Upper Rother catchment. So this map here shows the project area for the NFM work, and you can see Chesterfield in the centre, sort of roughly in the centre there. But the catchment stretches from sort of Pilsley in the south up to the Moss Valley in the north, sort of around Eckington. And I'm just coming to the end of my first 2 years, as I mentioned before, and these 2 years really were a bit of a pilot to see if there was indeed opportunity and the appetite for NFM within the catchment. We also wanted to start just developing relationships with key stakeholders in the area and getting project proposals together and starting to identify and securing funding for delivering some of those NFM projects, and to start leading NFM volunteer days. So it's fair to say that there is definitely a lot of opportunity for NFM in the catchment. We've been working with an organisation called ICASP, who are researchers from multiple universities to help us identify areas within the catchment that would be good for putting in different types of NFM measures that help reduce flood risk, but also reduce pollution from agricultural runoff and create wildlife habitat. So I know this map's a little bit hard to see, so you don't really need to see the detail. It's just to show you an example map from the work that we've done with them, showing us the Moss Valley catchment. And you can see here that there's different things drawn on the map which highlight different NFM measures, such as woodland planting, leaky dams, buffer strips, and so on. And we're going to be working with ICASP on a kind of a bolt-on project to this work that they did, which will help us look in more detail at where we can have the greatest impact on reducing flood risk through NFM, and actually trying to quantify the impact of some of those measures going in, just so that we get a much better understanding and help us to take a more strategic approach to how we're going to deliver NFM in the catchment to have the biggest impact that we can. And we've also come across other opportunities ourselves just by being out and about and talking to the various stakeholders about problem areas and so on. So we'll just take a quick look now at some of the projects we've got on the go. So we're sticking in the Moss Valley here, so that same catchment. I was just showing you the opportunity map. And this is north of Chesterfield and is a catchment where we have lots of fine sediment being washed into the Moss Brook, causing problems in the river as well as problems with downstream flood risk. My colleagues, particularly Matt, who is our catchment officer, have been doing quite a lot of work in the Moss, working with the Moss Valley Wildlife Group, and through 2 of their lovely volunteers, we were put in touch with Heather Hunt, who owns a 12-hectare woodland at the top of the catchment, shown here in the red circle. So you can just about make that out. And Heather is managing the woodland to enhance biodiversity at the same time as restoring it as a working woodland with opportunities for education and nature connection. So Heather was very keen to find out whether she might be able to incorporate NFM into her management plan for the woods. And it turns out that she definitely can. So there are 2 tributaries to the Moss running through the woods, as well as plenty of other little gullies and small flows that appear during heavy rainfall, which means there's lots of opportunity to interrupt and slow down these flows of water before they reach the Moss Brook itself. Oh, sorry, gone the wrong way there. There we go. So we've now had a number of volunteer days at Heather's. The first was just before COVID struck in February last year, where we had a big group of people out, which now feels very strange thinking about doing. But we made some spiling, which is this woven hazel structure in the top right photo, over a very small channel, which again just acts to slow down water behind it and back up when you get heavy rainfall. So again, it's just kind of a small interruption to the flow there. We also did things like gully stuffing and moved some large timbers into place in preparation for building leaky dams. And the plan had been to carry these on regularly, but of course that wasn't to be. But we have managed a few more days between lockdowns on a much smaller scale to make sure that they were COVID secure. And we've managed to get some leaky dams in thanks to a really great effort from Heather and the volunteers. And we've seen these kicking into action several times now during heavy rain, which is one of the videos I showed you earlier of the leaky dam. And we've just got another one now that we can have a quick look at. So this is during Storm Christoph. And again, I'll just play this one now so you can see it happening again. So this one, the worst of the storm hit overnight. So it is a bit more difficult to make out, but hopefully you can see this kind of dark mass, which is the water, will suddenly rise and back up behind the dam there. So you can see there's quite a substantial amount of water being held behind the dam. So yeah, so these dams have been working really well. And there we go, that's just it in the daytime. And so you can see it's still holding a bit of water there behind it. And this just shows the spiling that I mentioned. So we've got sort of a before the storm in the bottom left photo and then during the storm. So again, you can just see the amount of water that's backing up behind there. And Heather and her volunteers have been putting more of these structures in too, which is great to see. So again, obviously, the more of those we have in the landscape, the better. And we're also going to be working with the Sheffield and Rotherham Wildlife Trust and Woodland Trust, who own adjacent woodlands to Heather's, to put in some more NFM measures there, which will be a really great way to have as big an impact as possible right at the top of this catchment. So a very different type of project that we've been working on is the development of an NFM scheme at a country park upstream of Chesterfield. So this is Grassmoor Country Park. It was a former colliery and was also used for wastewater treatment for the nearby Avenue Coke Works, but it's since been transformed into a country park. And the streams leaving the site flow to an area of high flood risk in central Chesterfield. So the park's in a really great location for helping to temporarily hold back water from this flood zone. And we've come up with a potential scheme that builds on where the park is already holding water to help increase that capacity and just hold it back for a bit longer so that it slow flows into the brook. And essentially this will involve some landscaping, just to sculpture some features into the site. So creating more of those kind of shallow scrapes and temporary ponds where water can collect during heavy rainfall and then drain away afterwards. And this will also help to create some different habitats in the park. So we will get an increase in the different plants on site with knock-on effects for wildlife. And the change in the landscape will actually be really quite subtle, but it will be able to hold more water and just create that little bit more interest with this more diversity in the plants and the little sort of micro habitats that will be created through these new features. So we're going to be asking the public for feedback on these plans online on our website in the near future. So there'll be more detail there soon if you're keen to have a look and comment on what we're hoping to do there. Please keep an eye out for these. And we will be then finalising plans and going to planning permission and hoping to deliver the first stage of this scheme by the end of the year. So another aspect of the project is working with farmers. And this year we have been working with a farmer on some of his land, which is also in Grassmore, just a little bit further north from the country park, which has the River Rother running through it. And we've been doing a whole range of things here to, again, just help slow flows over his land and create more wildlife habitat. So this includes putting in multiple scrapes in the floodplain, shown here holding water after the various sort of winter storms that we've had, as well as some field corner ponds. So this is an area of the field where it's kind of at the bottom of the slope, it gets very wet and it was too wet for doing any planting of crops. So it's an ideal place really to put in these ponds, which have also filled up after the storms, and you know the sort of capacity in there comes and goes. And they all look a little bit sparse at the moment, and that's because they were only put in towards the end of last year, so the vegetation hasn't really had much chance to grow here yet, but as that grows they will kind of blend into the landscape a little bit more. We've also been doing work to the hedgerows on the farm, with some of them being laid, and this is essentially to just rejuvenate the hedge. So they had been laid in the past but not for a very long time, and we're in need of a little bit of TLC. And so doing this just allows the hedges to grow bushier, which is better for wildlife, but also creating a kind of a happier, healthier hedge increases how much water it can absorb in the soil beneath it. We've also planted a new hedgerow, and we're trying to establish a floodplain meadow. So we've sown 2 areas on either side of the river with meadow seed, which was collected from another floodplain meadow. And again, luckily managed to get a volunteer day out in between lockdowns with some of our volunteers helping us to sow the seed in the meadow. And the idea here again is you're just creating that rougher vegetation, so more resistance to water that's travelling through it, and obviously creating more habitat for wildlife. And then finally, we've been putting in some herbal lays at the farm as well. So these are what I was talking about earlier, these kind of diverse mixes of grasses, legumes and herbs with some deep rooting species that will help to break up the compaction in the soil, making more space for water. And they'll also be left to flower, which means there's going to be a good resource there for pollinators and other invertebrates that you wouldn't get in a normal sort of normal crop field. And there's all sorts of other benefits these herbal lays bring to kind of the farm business as well. And as well as these, we're going to be establishing buffer strips along the entire course of the river as well. So that is just a very quick run through of some of the types of NFM projects that we're delivering. And hopefully that's given you a bit of a better understanding of what NFM is all about and a flavour of the NFM work that we've been involved with so far. A massive thank you, as always, to all of the volunteers and landowners involved, so key to making a difference and making this work happen. If you're not already volunteering with us and you'd like to, then do get in touch, and you can either email us or head to our website where you can find details on signing up as a volunteer, as well as lots of other info on there and how to sign up to our newsletter, with lots of other interesting bits coming your way. And here's all the other ways that you can follow us. We've got a YouTube channel now as well, where you can find all of the talks that we've been doing, as well as other videos, should you want to check those out. The talk this evening was free, but if anybody would like to make a donation, then you can head to the bottom of our website and click on the little PayPal donate button too. So yeah, thank you all very much for coming and listening. Hope it's been of interest.